I'm your host, Matt Blackburn. Today, I'm speaking with Kiran Krishnan for the second time. He is the microbiologist at Just Thrive. I like how articulate he is and all of the analogies that he uses. Just really easy to understand. He's not trying to talk over anyone's head, which is refreshing. So this episode is actually focused on the immune system and the effects of immunoglobulins on the immune system. And these are really fascinating compounds that are found in colostrum, as he mentions, but you can also get them in an extract form from Just Thrive, and that is their IgG supplement. I talk about my experience with it in the interview. It's been pretty profound, and I think it's something that you could cycle or use in context. He talks about how they actually increase CD4 plus T cells, which I'll talk about more at the end of the show. I was researching that little rabbit hole, and that's pretty cool. I had no idea about those types of T cells. And so he talks about everything that immunoglobulins do. And at the end, we had a pretty fun Q&A where people from my Instagram chimed in and asked questions. We had some about allergies, food allergies, prebiotics. What are things you'll notice taking spore-based probiotics? And yeah, it was just a really fun interview. You guys will really enjoy it. And anyone dealing with any kind of autoimmune or immune issue, viral, which is kind of trending right now with the whole WHO scare and what I think is a bioweapon with the coronavirus. So this is a timely show to listen to. So here is Kiran Krishnan. Enjoy. All right, I'm here with Kiran Krishnan. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be back, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, I really enjoyed our first chat last year about the probiotic product, the spore-based probiotic that you guys have, and
yeah,
I've had tremendous results, and I wasn't taking it consistently, and then after I spoke with you, and really picked your brain on it, then I haven't taken a night off. I take it every night before bed after my dinner, and it's made a huge difference, just that consistency with that product. So.
Yeah, and to be honest, I mean, I'm kind of the same. When we first came out with it several years ago, I'm just notoriously bad with being regular with my supplements, and I would notice every time I take it consistently, even for just a couple of weeks, I would start to see all these benefits, and then I'd kind of fall off the wagon, if you will. But over the last 3 years, because I travel so much and I put my body through a lot of stress, I've been taking it, and it's one of those things I don't get away from, including a couple of the other things we'll talk about today as well. I've made myself become really consistent with some of these other products, and we'll talk about why that's so important.
I love it. Yeah, and jumping into that, I follow a lot of people that are on extreme diets, and I'm pretty much on an animal-based diet because I'm here in North Idaho, and there's great milk
Right.
and grass-finished steak, and I'm pretty much on a milk, honey, and meat diet, and I feel amazing. And the only thing lacking there is fiber, so I tend to eat like a raw carrot a day to help with endotoxin, and it's kind of like nature's antibiotic. But that's the one thing I keep going back and forth with is fiber. Like there's a lot of carnivore proponents that say that it's not necessary, but if they're not ingesting any fiber, they should be on a prebiotic, right? Like yours.
Right. That's the key. Yeah. And there's evidence of this actually. There was a study that came out that was actually quite surprising, and this kind of ties into the gluten side of things as well. But the study showed that, and it was a large scale study done on celiac patients and people with severe gluten intolerance, so different degrees of celiac. What they showed is that the first year, once you go off of a gluten-free diet, once you go on a gluten-free diet, your mortality rate increases dramatically, right? And that is totally counterintuitive. You're thinking, wait a minute, gluten is a toxin for my gut, for my immune system. It's causing all of this damage in my gut lining. It's driving inflammatory processes. Why is it when I stop gluten, all of a sudden my mortality rate from cardiovascular disease and and diabetes and cancers, all that go up dramatically, right? And then when you start digging into the data, you come to find out that Americans, more than 85% of their fiber intake comes from gluten-based sources, right? Wheat, barley, and rye, basically. And when you take somebody who's sensitive to gluten and you put them on a gluten-free diet, they basically completely remove their prebiotics, their fermentable carbohydrates. So they go into a diet that has virtually no prebiotics in it. That in itself can dramatically increase your risk for mortality, especially if your gut is already damaged to that point, right? Because they've been damaging the gut through consuming the gluten all that time. So there was a couple of really telling things about that study. Number one, that getting some amount of prebiotics in your daily routine is important and critical. Number two, just avoiding the toxigenic stuff is not going to heal the damage that already exists. You need to actually do things actively, incorporate things into your diet, into your supplementation to actively heal the existing damage. And so it's really important to add in some degree of oligosaccharides or functional prebiotics if you're not getting it in your diet, right? So that's part of the reason why we came up with the prebiotic product. And the focus of it was really on how do we specifically increase the growth of keystone strains? Because when you start to support and increase the growth of keystone strains, you automatically increase diversity in the rest of the microbiome, because that's one of the key things they do, right? So we isolated and found oligosaccharides that specifically fed certain keystone strains like Akkermansia and Fecalum bacteria, and they themselves will then increase the diversity of the rest of the microbiota. So that just the functional prebiotic alone takes care of a lot of the need for fiber.
That's fascinating. Yeah, and I guess if someone doesn't want to, add another supplement to their million, then I guess getting natural fibers. But I feel that precision prebiotic. I'm a big fan of it, and that's really interesting. About 85% of the fiber comes from gluten sources. I started eating, in the refrigerated section of health food stores, you can often find breads that are higher quality than the
right,
the room temp breads. And I started on the sprouted barley toast.
Yep.
And I'll have that with eggs in the morning, 4 or 5 eggs with some, put jam or butter on it. And I feel really good. I mean, I take some of my digestive enzymes with it, but I feel great. And there's a difference with sprouting, right? That deactivates a lot of the toxins and makes the gluten more digestible. And
yeah, it helps. It helps to a certain degree, but I think a lot of it is also, in your case, you're doing a lot of things to help with your gut, and you're taking your spores, you're doing all of these things. So all of those kind of negate the transient inflammatory and leaky gut that occurs from exposure to gluten. But so many people are getting their exposure to the gluten on top of already having a poor lifestyle, right? So
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I try to teach balance, and if someone's in a healing state, you don't stay on that nutrition protocol or diet protocol forever. And I think people are like kind of getting orthorexic, kind of extreme, and just staying on these really extreme programs. I was there, so I know. So.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, awesome. And so where does the IgG come in? Because you guys came out with that product, and I'm a natural skeptic with new supplements, and I just started taking 4 at a time, once a day. And I'm very prone to just allergies from dust. I remember growing up, and every time my parents would clean, or, I guess I cleaned sometimes, but dust would come up and then I would sneeze. Right. And if I ever have that kind of reaction cleaning around the house here and I take your supplement, I'm like immune. Like I don't even sneeze. So it really seems to calm my immune system or strengthen it. It's really interesting. It's a combination of immunoglobulins, like 4 different types, right?
Yeah, predominantly IgG, but there is some IgM and IgA in it as well. And it's about 50% or so IgG. What's the way we even came across it is we were part of a small consortium of companies that were kind of developing studies around dealing with HIV enteropathy HIV enteropathy is the severe leaky gut that HIV people experience. And in fact, the NIH published studies showing that that is the biggest driver of mortality in HIV, over viral load itself, right? So all of the diseases that people with HIV eventually die from, things like pneumonia and Kaposi sarcoma and so on, those things are all perpetuated and driven by the leaky gut that they experience. So what is happening in the digestive system and in the gut lining of HIV people is exactly what's happening in non-HIV people, but in a much protracted, slower state. In the case of HIV, it actually happens much faster, right? So we were working with a couple other companies, and we came across this company that had this IgG product, and they have it as a bulk ingredient, and they had published a couple of studies already on HIV subjects showing that just the presence of the IgG in the digestive tract in itself could start to repair the damage that's being done to the mucosa, and then also reduce the inflammatory response in the mucosa, and then also, which was quite surprisingly, increase the proliferation of something called CD4 positive T cells. Those are the really important adaptive immune defensive cells. And in the case of HIV, what turns HIV into AIDS is the diminishing of the CD4 positive T cells, right? So you lose your immune system, if you will. They were able to show an actual increase even in the presence of the disease. So the ability of this IgG product to modulate immune response and then upregulate the adaptive part of your immune response, the tolerance part, is really, really powerful. And we right away, it made us realize that, hey, this is a really important component to gut healing. And so we started conceptualizing product, and we ended up launching it, and it's become such a critical part for so many people in terms of maintaining healthy, resilient gut, and then, or if you're in the healing state, of really kind of driving the healing. Now, your example with the dust is really interesting, and we get a lot of people telling us about their sensitivities that have been modulated now. And a lot of that is because it increases the adaptive response within the body versus allowing the triggering of the inflammatory response in the body.
That's awesome. And I have a bunch of Q&A questions, which we probably won't get to. I have like 30 here, but I'll try to summarize a lot of them. A lot of people asked about histamine, and I get a lot of that on Instagram. People ask me, what do you recommend for histamine intolerance or high histamine? And I think there's a lot of different beliefs about it and different protocols, but this would be a good start, right?
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. So one of the other things that the IgG does is it's a great specific binder, right? So people use binders like activated charcoal and clays to kind of bind things in the gut that they think are toxigenic, and then take it out. The problem with most of those kind of conventional binders is they will also bind good stuff and take it out. They can even bind good bacteria and take it out. And so it becomes important to get more specificity in your neutralization. And that's what IgG does, because it's an antibody. It has a physical conformation for certain toxins. For example, it binds about 12 different mold toxins, and it specifically neutralizes mold toxins and takes them out. It binds dozens of bacterial toxins. It binds actual bacteria themselves. It can bind viral proteins, viral coats. So it really helps kind of sop up things that are toxigenic in your gut and take them out. Now, how is that related to the histamine issue? Well, histamine is produced in the body in a couple of responses. Number one is it's one of the ways that your microbiome signals to your immune system that there's an infection, right? So your microbiome has all of this crosstalk with your immune system. And one of the ways that the microbiome signals to the immune system is by production of histamine and indole. And when you have high histamine production, it may mean that you have a chronic latent infection going on somewhere in your mucosa, and thereby all of this overactive histamine response. Histamine is also released then by cells that induce allergic response, and it gives you that itchy, dry, inflammatory kind of response in the body, and that may mean that you have an overt allergic type of response to all types of proteins coming into the system, right? So you may or may not be intolerant to the histamine itself. You may have an overreactive allergic response in your immune system that results in histamine production. And histamine causes all kinds of inflammation and upregulation of your adrenals and all kinds of responses in the body. So being able to modulate your immune response the way the IgG does, and the spores help with that as well, may be able to reduce the histamine-like response to all the things that are coming to the body. And then also being able to target chronic latent infections may reduce the amount of histamine that your microbiome is actually producing. So those are two mechanisms by which the probiotic and then the IgG can actually, counteract some of the negative things that are going on. Now, beyond that, there's a lot of speculation of what else histamine intolerance may mean. It may not even be the right name for the condition. It's not necessarily a intolerance to histamine. It may be an overt production of histamine. It may be an overt response using histamine. But so far, we know that people that we work with histamine intolerance do really well with the IgG and the probiotic.
That was awesome. Thanks for that. And it sounds like the probiotic and the ultimate IgG, you just traveled with those two alone. That would be super powerful. Totally. Being exposed to, now we have coronavirus and all this crazy. And right. I think that's only killing like 1.5 to 2% of people.
It is, yeah. It's a great news story. I mean, this year's flu's mortality rate, I think, is around 5 to 6%. So this year's influenza B and influenza A that's circulating around is far more deadly than the coronavirus is. But of course it's old news, so we don't hear about it as much until it's time for the companies to really push the vaccine. Then you start hearing all this stuff about the flu. But yeah, the coronavirus mortality rate is actually pretty low.
That's probably people that are already compromised, and so I have a lot of people.
Yeah, it's mostly the elderly and the very young.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
Which is true for the flu too. Most of the people that end up succumbing to the flu actually tend to be immunocompromised or really elderly or like the very young.
Wow. And most of these people, I'm sure almost 100% have never heard the word endotoxin or lipopolysaccharide, right? Or they don't understand any of the basics of what we're dealing with here. So
totally. And at the end of the day, I mean, there are viruses all over the place. The vast majority of us actually get exposed to the flu. We just don't develop symptoms, right? There was a UK study that showed they did a post-flu season survey where they surveyed, I think, something like 28,000, 30,000 people, and they did blood tests on all of them. And the vast majority of them did not ever experience any symptoms of the flu. But when they checked their antibodies, they found in most of them had antibodies against the flu virus, which means that virtually all of them had exposure to the flu in some way or the other, and then the immune system took care of it. So they never ended up getting symptoms, right? And the exposure level might have been just enough to trigger the immune system, but not overwhelming to the system. So you're able to build defense against it and kind of build a natural immunity for the season. All of that depends on the function of your immune system that starts in the gut, right? And 80% of your immune system starts in the gut. If your microbiome isn't diverse, if your mucosa is inflamed, if you have low levels of adaptive immune response, if you've got all of these pro-inflammatory responses in your gut, then the rest of your immune system can't work and you become way more susceptible to all of these infections. So for, like what you said, I travel a lot. I flew over 300,000 miles last year, and I never leave without my IgG and my spores, and I take those religiously when I travel to kind of protect yourself.
That's really awesome. And that's a good segue actually into this question. We might as well just start because people have some really good questions. Can the probiotics survive while you're taking something like wild oregano, which I promote and talk about? Can you take those at the same time and still be effective?
You can, yeah. In fact, oregano, allicin, and we've looked at a number of these natural antimicrobials. One of the really strong natural antimicrobials, like biocidin, from biobotanical research, we've actually incubated the spores in their liquid for like 3 weeks, and they're still alive. So they're perfectly stable in the presence of antimicrobials. So if you want to take them together, you could totally do that.
I love it. And let's see, what's the number one thing you'll notice on the probiotic? For me, it was like increased energy, decreased stress. Definitely noticed those too.
Yeah. So I'll go through kind of the top 3 or 4 things that people tell us, right? One of the things that people tell us is a decreased craving, and a decreased craving for sugars and things that they might be having a difficulty with. And then number 2, like what you mentioned, is quite frequent. What people tell us about increased energy and decreased stress. And then number 3, for people with primary GI issues, people who have IBS and low tolerance for foods and tend to get cramping, bloating, and all that, that tends to alleviate quite significantly in a relatively short amount of time. With kids, you'll notice behavior changes. Kids respond to stress. Their anxious response. In adults, we get anxious, we get panicked, and we may go into depression and so on. In kids, the anxious response often is translated to behavioral outbursts and tantrums and things like that. And so, what we tend to see with kids is a nice reduction in that kind of behavioral response.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think I've said this story before on my podcast, but I was at juvenile hall for 4 years as a teacher's assistant and substitute. And after lunch,
not as a resident.
Never as a resident. I was a good kid, but after lunch they would go nuts. It's like they were almost falling asleep, and then they would eat lunch, and they would literally, like the movie The Gremlins. It's like after midnight, and they would turn into gremlins. Like
right,
it was night and day.
And so what that is that huge endotoxic response, right? And the endotoxic response disrupts the HPA axis, and when the HPA axis is disrupted, then you can't control your anxious behavior and all of that stuff. So people kind of go nuts. And a flood of endotoxins creates kind of a panic in people. And you can see that in younger people in terms of behavior.
Yeah, I would be scared to go in a public school nowadays. I mean, I know it's a lot worse than when I went.
Totally, yeah. Absolutely.
Let's see. I got a couple questions along this line on the probiotic. Should we take it daily, or should we cycle on and off of it? It's something daily, right? And it's really what you're using it for, either to maintain or to heal. Yeah,
exactly. It is daily. These are transient organisms, so they stay for about 20-21 days. So they go in there, they do their work, they move down the intestines, they continue to do the work, and then eventually they leave the gut. They go back into the outside environment, or that's how they're programmed to function. So it acts as kind of like your daily protection, just like every single day you have all of these things around you that push your microbiome out of balance, right? All the stuff that you're exposed to in the outside environment inadvertently, pesticides and fungicides and herbicides and all of these things in our drinking water supply and all that. All of those things that inherently disrupt our microbiome, this brings it back and keeps the microbiome in check. And we've done a study like that on glyphosate, where we use a pediatric microbiome model, and what we saw is that the moment you start adding in Cheerio level of Roundup, you start to see huge disruptions in the microbiome in terms of both the organisms and the metabolic response of the microbiome. And then keeping the glyphosate exposure going, we started adding in the spores, and then we started to see a reversing of that dysfunction. So the spores have a way of kind of protecting the gut and reversing the damage caused by glyphosate and Roundup.
That's incredible. Yeah, I see a lot of like MLM companies promoting products to detox glyphosate, and it's like, it just seems, I'm just telling people, like, just spore-based probiotics from Just Thrive. That's like the start.
There's no, I've looked, because I'm in the glyphosate research area, and there's no research behind any glyphosate detox product, right? There's nothing out there that really shows that it can somehow remove glyphosate from the system. Your body has ways of trying to do that, but the problem is the moment you get exposed to it, it acts as a strong antimicrobial. That's what it does. So it's already damaging the gut. Even if you remove it later on, the damage is already being done.
That's interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it's a really heavy, it's a metal chelator, mineral
It is,
chelator.
yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
not good for us that it requires minerals for enzymes to work.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's chelating all these minerals in your gut itself, that can actually support the growth of certain toxigenic bacteria like Clostridia. That's one of the reasons why Clostridia does really well in the presence of glyphosate. And that's the correlation there between that and autism spectrum disorders, is that high levels of glyphosate exposure lead to an overgrowth of certain types of Clostridia. Those types of Clostridia also tend to be present at high levels on kids on the spectrum. So it's kind of all correlated, and detoxifying yourself later on from glyphosate or after exposure doesn't quite do the same as going in there and kind of repairing the microbiome damage and allowing the gut to take care of the glyphosate.
Interesting. Yeah, that term on the spectrum is interesting. People get offended, but I say we're all on the spectrum because we're all on different
Right,
levels
yeah.
of exposure, right? It all affects the
Totally.
brain.
The word spectrum is a key, right? It's a large variation of we could call it function. I don't know if we want to call it dysfunction as well, because then people will get even more offended. But it's a huge variation of functionality, and I wouldn't be surprised if we're all on it some end of it. Right.
Yeah, even up here in Idaho, there's a train and they spray crazy stuff on the railroad. And I have a creek here, there's rivers, and
totally
there's exposure everywhere, even if you're out of the city. So
right. Yeah, you can't avoid it.
This was a good question about sourcing, and people ask me about my products, like I have nattokinase, and a lot of enzymes are sourced from mold, and that people get freaked out about that, and
Right.
my digestive enzymes are, but there's no residue on it, and so people ask like how are your probiotics sourced and made? I'm sure some of that's proprietary, but the same thing with the IgG. Product.
So the probiotics are made through fermentation. The original strains were isolated from healthy human volunteers decades ago. They were isolated from fecal samples looking for commensal bacillus spores. And then that work was all done by Royal Holloway, University of London. Then they built this big library of strains that are commensal spore strains. We went in there and partnered with them and selected certain strains that we wanted to work with that had the best characteristics that we thought would have a lot of efficacy. And then once we selected and got those strains, since then we've been growing them through fermentation. So they're thrown in a liquid fermentation tank and they're grown up through fermentation like you would do a kombucha or something else. Now the IgG is sourced from it's a bovine serum. So they take the blood out of cows, and then they spin out the immunoglobulins, so through a centrifuge, separates out all the blood components and then the immunoglobulin components, which are a particular size, and then they purify it through a freeze drying process to purify the IgG. So it comes directly, it doesn't come from the dairy component, it doesn't come from the colostrum side of things. So there's no dairy component at all because it's a direct product out of the blood.
That's interesting. And hopefully it's humane. I have some vegetarian vegans that follow me.
Yeah, I mean, these are animals that are going to be slaughtered for meat, right?
Oh, okay.
So it's not done just for this product. These are animals that are already going into slaughter for meat, and then there's no use for the blood products in the meat industry. So the company is good about taking those products and creating value-added medical components out of it.
That's interesting. Yeah, earlier today I saw some carnivores are like literally drinking blood. That's kind of vampire style. I don't know about that one.
Yeah, I know it's hard to adapt that move, but like the what is it? The Magi tribe in
Yeah.
Africa has been doing that for thousands of years. There's a lot of belief. There's cultures that drink blood from bats.
Mhm.
There's a lot of belief in the elixir effect, if you will, of blood. But a lot of it comes from, the red blood cells are just red blood cells that are carrying
Mhm.
oxygen. Outside of that, there's all of these immune components in the blood that
Mhm.
are really quite important.
I'll just stick with a good juicy steak.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up colostrum too, because my body responds really well to dairy, especially like an A2 heirloom
Hmm.
dairy. Like I do a lot of Guernsey milk, and
Yeah.
um, because you can get it from colostrum, it's just not as concentrated, right? In like a colostrum powder.
Right. Yeah. So and we looked at when we were looking at this kind of gut healing repair idea, we looked at colostrum and although there's a lot of good stuff in colostrum, we were very focused on the effects of IgG and you only find it at somewhere around 8 to 10% in colostrum. So it's roughly 5 times higher in concentration in this particular product in the bovine serum IgG.
Oh, it's interesting. Okay, cool. I got a couple questions about side effects from the probiotic. A
Hmm.
couple people messaged me and said they noticed like bloating, and for some it just lasts a week or two, and that's kind
Yeah.
of like a die-off kind of symptom, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Mhm.
die-off can be complicated, Just imagine your gut is this like really crazy elaborate ecosystem. There's thousands of actors in there, all doing different things. Some of them are bad and dysfunctional and at a too high level. So anytime you put a stressor in there, like the spores who are trying to make a change to the microbiome, that change can be responded to with a fight back by the pathogens that are trying to stay alive. And so some of that fighting increases their metabolic processes, or it causes them to release toxins. It causes them to have die off, which then releases some of their toxins that are within the cell. All of those things can have really interesting responses in some people. So some people, and the most common response is just a little loose stool and cramping for 4 or 5 days for some people, and then it's gone. I've had other people that have weird dreams. They have vivid dreams for a week. We've had people that may get a little rash on the skin somewhere. We get some people that feel very lethargic. Some people that go through a period of increased constipation. And die-off is just such a crazy, complex thing that, naturopaths call them healing crises. Just the ecological change in the gut will drive in about 10 to 15% of people some sort of die-off like response. 99% of the time you just kind of work through it and it's gone in a week. Some rare cases it lasts a little bit longer, and in those cases we have them actually just go slower. They take half a capsule or even a quarter capsule for a longer period of time just to kind of manage those die-off symptoms. But for the most part, it's a good thing that you're seeing that kind of response because it just shows that there's a profound change that's trying to occur in the gut.
That was awesome. Yeah, I like on the bottle it says 1,000 times better survivability versus Greek yogurt and leading probiotics. I think that's new. You guys
Right.
didn't have that on there, and it's
Yeah,
great for
totally.
people to
Yeah.
see that.
Totally. And that's actually a dialed down number because when we actually do the math, it's actually more like, a million times better survivability. But then the problem is that sounds a little hokey if you put it on the bottle. So we're like, let's dial it down to 1,000 so it doesn't sound too crazy. But
Take
the
off a
math
few
supports
zeros.
a much higher level.
That's so cool. Yeah, because I get a lot of questions like, is yogurt good for me? And I've looked into like lactic acid, especially created from just over exercising
Hmm.
or restricting carbohydrate too much. And that excess lactic acid can cause a lot of issues. Then people are doing
Hmm.
kombuchas and yogurts on top of it.
Totally.
And it's just too
Yeah.
much.
It is, yeah, and the whole thing is that if you don't have the right kind of bacteria to convert that lactic acid into short chain fatty acids and other things, then you're going to get an overabundance of and cause lactic acidosis, and that can be quite problematic. And also one of the problems I have with a lot of the store-bought yogurt is you don't really know what's in it.
Mhm.
It's a culture, right? So there's a fermentation process, and but you really don't know what is the result of that fermentation process. If you're doing it at home, or there's some sort of traditional version that you tend to follow, and your body's is used to experiencing, that may be a different story. But a lot of the stuff that they're culturing in factories and in big processing centers, typically they find a way to screw those things up and make them more toxic, right? I mean, anytime you take a product that started out good, and then you scale it into massive multi-billion-dollar company processing, they screw it up somehow. They take something good that used to have benefit and now irradiate the benefit. Like kombucha, is a
Mhm.
perfect example, right? The vast majority of kombucha on the market, especially the very big brands, are just basically sugar water with flavoring. They just don't have the essence of what kombucha is supposed to be, because they're trying to make the fermentation process quick, more
Mhm.
efficient, less energy costing. They don't have the time for it to wait 78 hours or whatever it takes. They don't have the time to process it the way it should be processed. Because when these beverages were first conceptualized thousands of years ago, they weren't thinking about scale and economics and all of that, right? They were just doing it with an artist type hand. And so anytime you scale these things up, it always kind of gets screwed up.
Yeah, that's well said. I have friends that make sourdough bread, and last
Hmm.
time I was at Costco, you can find ready to bake sourdough bread that's just, in
Yep.
plastic, and there's 3 loaves, and it's
Yep.
better than probably other stuff you can get that's, already baked or whatever, but
Yeah.
it wasn't the same for
No.
sure.
No, it's never the same. It's never the same. They
Yeah.
always screw it up. Anytime you scale things, it gets screwed up.
Yeah, that's a really good point. They weren't trying to get into Costco back then. So.
Right, exactly, right? I mean, it's like fermentation processes have all this ancient ties to how they understand when the ferment is done, and
Mhm.
what are the characteristics of it that gives them all of that empirical data that it has health benefits. All of that is thrown out the door the moment you put it in a big, 100,000 gallon factory, and you're cranking out millions of bottles of it.
Mhm.
It just becomes an economics exercise.
Yeah, that's a good point. Will spore-based probiotics help with mental disorders like OCD? Have you seen any studies about that?
Yeah, so there's some real clear ties with the over abundance of LPS in the blood and cognitive dysfunction. So things like schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, anorexia nervosa, and mood disorders. OCD would fall into those. And LPS seems to play a really significant role in all of these cognitive mood disorders. And so just reducing the amount of LPS that's flowing into the circulation using the spores will be a big help and support in those kind of conditions. There are, of course, other things that you'd want to do behavioral wise, nutrition wise, and so on. But just stopping that flood of LPS into the system will be a big help.
That's awesome. This is a good one about allergies and food allergies. Can those
Hmm.
be gotten rid of? And this is something that I think about a lot because people are allergic to everything now, and
Hmm.
there is usually an LPS endotoxin overload connection to chronic allergies, right?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So, allergies come about because we tend to respond to things with an inflammatory reaction rather than the adaptive reaction, right? So our immune system has these regulatory mechanisms driven by something called a Treg cell system. These are T regulatory cells whose job it is to monitor immune responses to things and dampen unfavorable immune responses. So when foods come into your system, into your digestive tract, they are supposed to be met with inflammatory immune cells. That's normal. It's kind of like your first line of defense. But shortly after they are met with inflammatory immune cells, you get T regulatory cells that come along and suppress that immune reaction, thereby teaching your immune system that, hey, this is a normal nutrient. We don't have to react to it that way. And that is called oral tolerance. The breakdown in oral tolerance comes because our barrier structures in our intestinal lining are diminished, which means that all of the food particles enter deeper into our intestinal lining. And the deeper you go into the intestinal lining, the more robust an inflammatory immune response you're going to get to it, right? That's because as things enter deeper into your intestinal lining, your body thinks it's going to break through that intestinal epithelium and enter the blood circulation. And so it responds to things with more vigor, if you will. And then because a diverse, healthy microbiome is responsible for upregulating the Treg system, if we don't have a diverse, healthy microbiome, then the Treg system, the regulatory system that gives us the tolerance, is not functioning the way it should. So it's very easy to develop intolerance to foods through this continuous inflammatory cascade that we experience because of our thin gut linings and our dysfunctional immune responses in the gut. All of it driven by a low diversity, higher amounts of pathogens and low keystone strains within the microbiome itself.
Oh, that was awesome. Yeah, I talk a lot about accumulation. Like I grew up eating tons of vegetable oil.
Mm-hmm.
I go out with my friends after school and get a burrito after the gym or whatever, and did that for years and years and years. And we've accumulated so many things. I mean, iron fortification. I ate loads and loads of iron filings in my cereal growing up.
Yeah.
But the same thing with the gut lining damage. I think people start in the wrong place, like doing a 10-day green juice cleanse or something, instead of starting at this foundational level. Like, look, I grew up in America, the American experiment. I have gut lining damage because I did what everyone else was doing. That's like a logical starting point for me, instead of trying to do a green juice or a smoothie detox that'll probably just cause more damage.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. You're right. Because we have this thinking that there's things that have accumulated in the system that we have to detoxify. We have to remove them, right? Not thinking that, wait a minute, before we even think about removing and detoxifying things, we got to ensure that our baseline system is functioning, right? So it's almost like, you drive your car, let's say through water, toxic pond, and the the engine is flooded and it's not working, and the carburetor, if your car still has one, is not functioning, the spark plug is out, and then you're worried about drying the seats to get the car functioning, right? You're like, wait a minute, it's full of this toxic water. Let's dry the seats and the dashboard before we, in order to get the car running again. No, you got to get to the source, the engines, the foundations of what moves the vehicle. And for us, the foundation is the gut, the microbiome, the mucosal lining, the immune system that interacts with that every second of every day. Those are the things that we have to repair. And the beauty of it is, when those systems are functioning, they have their own natural way of detoxifying your system, right? Our body is designed as an amazing detoxing tool. We've got this whole cytochrome P450 mechanism. We've got a liver, a pancreas, we've got bile, we've got the microbiome. All of these things, your kidneys are constantly detoxifying your body. So true detox is supporting the systems that actually detoxify your body, right? Rather than trying to force detox by just going on some sort of liquid thing or, whatever else people are doing these days.
That was a great analogy. Yeah, one of my first blogs I wrote on my website was Endotoxin, a Logical Starting Point. I think I wrote that after our conversation, but I've been studying a lot about iron overload, reading some really interesting books on that. And I'm donating blood regularly, like every 3 months, and noticing a huge benefit there. And there's a huge connection between lipid peroxidation, iron overload, and endotoxin. And just by pulling the rug out from endotoxin, you're helping so many peripheral issues just from that. So
absolutely.
It's really cool.
Absolutely. It's tied to, it's funny because people send me questions and go, does LPS have anything to do with this random disease, right? And I go, probably, but let me look it up. And then I start looking at studies, and there is a clinical connection to it, to everything. It's LPS is tied to virtually every chronic illness. and it's an endotoxin, which means it's a toxin generated within ourselves. So you can move to the farthest corner of the earth and live the most pure life, but you can't get away from the LPS. It's in the gut, it's self-generated. And the only way to protect yourself from it is just to make sure that your gut lining and your the tight junctions and your microbiome are there to protect the translocation. And that's why when we built the company, that's where we started. We said, hey, if we can't provide a solution for the endotoxin problem, then we're really not helping a whole lot when it comes to digestive health and immune health, right? So we started with the endotoxin problem.
That's awesome. Are probiotics still effective if you don't take the prebiotics? They are. They're just not as much, right? If you don't have that food coming in for them. Or...
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of the functional effective probiotics require some amount of prebiotics to convert things to like short chain fatty acids, urolithins, convert lactate into butyrate and propionate and all that. So you will certainly benefit more by just getting some prebiotics in. You don't have to have a whole lot. Like you said, you eat, a carrot. You could eat 1 or 2 root vegetables a day. A small amount of it. It doesn't require a lot. You don't necessarily have to be getting 80 grams of fiber into your system. It's really kind of the smartest types of resistant starches and prebiotics that you get into your system.
Awesome. Do your products help with chronic fungal infections? I get a lot of fungus questions. Usually I'll recommend spore-based probiotics and oregano, and that kind of combo is good. But what are your thoughts on fungal infections?
Yeah, so most fungal infections, especially when we're talking about candida, tend to be opportunistic, right? So fungus on their own are not very strong pathogens. Most of them are opportunists. And which means that if they are overgrown, it's a great signal or canary in the coal mine that there's a bigger problem at hand. A lot of fungal overgrowths are driven by heavy metal toxicity, could be driven by iron overload, as you talk about a lot. It could be driven by a suppressed immune system, could be driven by an overt presence of a particular bacterial pathogen, because some fungus will collaborate with bacteria to exist. Like streptococcus will get together with candida and they'll form these biofilms together that protects one another. So they will cooperate with one another to create havoc within your system. So in general, you can hit it with the antifungals and that might help bring the levels down. But you have to go after the root cause, and the root cause is the inherent dysfunction that's allowing this opportunistic microbe to overgrow. So you do need to check your heavy metal levels. You do need to check, your iron overload risk. You do need to check, did I just recently take a course of antibiotics, or even up to 2 years ago, because you could still be having dysbiosis from even 2 years ago, taking a course of antibiotics. And so just go back to the fundamentals of increasing the diversity in the microbiome, fixing the leakiness in the gut, upregulating the immune system, and those systems will bring the fungus under control.
That's awesome. And I think this is the last question. This is one for me. I have friends that are really that keep their finger on the pulse of the vaccination what craziness, and the laws, like especially California, is getting really bad. And I'm friends with a lot of moms that are just really concerned for their children. And I remember I got shot up multiple times. Went to a private university and got the Tdap, and I was just dizzy for a week. And that was when I was somewhat health conscious, so I was slamming tablets and tablets of like crack cell chlorella every single day, but it didn't seem to help. Like it was probably more than heavy metals in there. But intuitively, I feel like the IgG, like if I got shot up again, I wouldn't, but I would take this every day.
Totally, yeah. We work with some parents, and there are some really open-minded pediatricians that look at mitigating risk from these things as well. One of the most important things is ensuring that you don't have an overt inflammatory response going on in the body, because what that vaccine is going to do is going to upregulate the inflammation, which can lead to systemic issues. like things like Guillain-Barré syndrome, which can be a side effect of vaccination at the wrong time, is perpetuated by this onset of a systemic inflammation. It's almost like a sepsis that occurs. And so it's about making sure your microbiome and your immune system are in a homeostatic state prior to having to expose yourself to those antigens. And again, like you said, it goes beyond the heavy metals and the other non-functional components within vaccines. That's a part of the problem. But just the response to the antigens themselves, if your immune system is triggered towards an inflammatory side, it can create this huge inflammatory response throughout the body. And that's one of the reasons why you don't go get your vaccines if you've got a cold, right? Even most doctors will tell you that now. If you have a slight temperature, if you've got a slight low-grade fever, they're not going to let you get your vaccines for the most part. All of that because they're starting to understand that when the immune system is already compromised and is under some sort of stress, if you hammer it with this insane cocktail of antigens, which makes your body think you have those diseases, it could send your body into an immune crisis, right? So it becomes really, really important to make sure that you're taking probiotics, prebiotics, things like quercetin, your appropriate vitamins and minerals and things so that you're in some sort of homeostatic state before having to be exposed to these things.
That's awesome. Yeah, I want to make it popular to donate blood or get a blood test instead of getting a flu shot, because that iron overload, it throws off cytochrome C oxidase in the mitochondria, and there's this deep relationship with iron and copper is so critical for our immune system. So
right.
Yeah, there's so many levels, but I feel like your products are awesome, and I love sharing them with people just because a lot of them address the root issue of what we have going on.
That's exactly the point. Yeah, that's why it's so important, because they basically go back to the root cause of a lot of things. And there's so many things we can do in the nutrition world and with herbals and other vitamins and all this stuff, that a lot of things that are really important and can be effective. But ultimately, what it has to come down to is we have to address the root cause first, and then we can build on top of that, right? So that's kind of how we envisioned the company before we started was, all right, how do we go after the root cause in many of these problems and then allow people to build a healthy base on top of that through all of these lifestyle changes, diet changes, and all the things that people do.
I love it. Well, Kiran, thanks for your time and coming on the show.
Yeah.
That was super awesome, and stick around. I'm going to close it out. Thanks so much.
It's my pleasure.
That wraps up today's show. I thought that was fascinating about the immunoglobulins and how they repair damage done to the mucosa. They increase the CD4 plus T cells, increase the adaptive response. They bind 12 different mold toxins. They bind dozens of bacterial toxins. Pretty cool stuff, especially with my research on lipopolysaccharide endotoxin and the systemic harm that endotoxin can have on the body, and actually how it works to upregulate lipid peroxidation with iron overload, and how all of these things work together. Endotoxin definitely makes everything worse. And I'm always fascinated with studying alcohol, because that's a big part of civilization, and there's just bars on every street, right? So people are drinking almost every weekend, and looking at the effects that ethanol has in the context of what humans are accumulating, which is endotoxin, iron, and toxic polyunsaturated fatty acids, and how these things all work together. And when you throw ethanol on that, it's like adding fuel to the fire. But for my research and talking with Adam Bergstrom with lipofuscin, ethanol can actually have a beneficial effect if you have a lot of these things under control. So I'm always fascinated to see how everything connects, and I like how Kiran went into that with the histamine and different things. It makes total sense. And I actually did some digging into the CD4 T cells, and I found a HIV connection. And it from what I saw, HIV, the reason why it's so destructive is because it actually targets the CD4 cells. That's the primary target of the HIV infection. So something like immunoglobulin can really help. And now that we have the coronavirus, and I don't know how much of it is blown out of proportion, I've definitely seen some footage that it's serious and that it's being suppressed as far as how far it's spreading. So yeah, there's a lot of misinformation to sift through, and it's kind of fascinating that we have to be our own doctors and physicians in today's world. We can't trust even the alternative health people because they're using an allopathic approach a lot of the time, or they're recommending toxic poison like omega-3 DHA algae oil, which is prescribed to pregnant women and children, which to me is just a crime against humanity. And so we have a lot of stuff to dig through. And the supplements that I have on my website, Just Thrive, their line of products, really high integrity. And their probiotic and their IgG have become my favorite just because of how effective they are at really supporting the body systemically and reducing stress. So I often get asked, where do I start with health? And I think that the spore-based probiotics are really foundational. I have a blog post all about endotoxin, and I have a 15% discount code for Just Thrive, Blackburn, and it's good to just do even a month. And if you combine this, which I recommend, with a raw organic carrot, and hopefully you're on Shilajit to handle the NPK minerals in that carrot, but it's not for nutrition, it's a cleansing thing. And carrot actually works similar to activated charcoal in its binding capacity to bacterial endotoxins in the gut. So I think it's a really smart idea to combine the Just Thrive probiotics with the daily raw carrot. And you could shred it, put some coconut oil on it, some olive oil, some Icelandic sea salt, and make it enjoyable. And then stack that with my CLF protocol and just keep adding in what you can. The systemic enzymes, I'm still getting raving testimonials daily on how effective those systemic enzymes are at clearing out fibrin or excess scar tissue in the body, which everyone has from iron overload, PUFA overload, lipofuscin. And something like the IgG supplement from Just Thrive, I look at it as a temporary help while you're doing the other work. It's like vitamin E, like my PUFA Protect product. It doesn't chelate iron. It doesn't remove your iron overload. What it's doing is it's providing a buffer to the extreme inflammation that's happening, especially in the liver with liver cirrhosis and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and just this chronic inflammation that you have in your liver that performs over 500 functions. Vitamin E goes in there, and it's helping protect against the iron overload. I just made a post about that, actually. There was a study that found that they introduced a lethal dose of iron to rats, and then they gave them vitamin E, and they were 100% protected, 100% survival rate with a lethal dose of iron. So that's pretty cool. I think vitamin E is really overlooked. I think immunoglobulins are overlooked in the context of healing an immune issue. I think it could just provide a nice little boost while you're doing the other foundational work, taking care of endotoxin with their spore-based probiotics, taking care of lipofuscin, removing the scar tissue throughout your body, and just working at this foundational level, right? Getting real water in your body. I feel like that's a huge missing piece that no one really ever talks about. And that's usually my reply when someone's trying to chase symptoms, as Josh Rubin says. And it's just a hamster wheel. You just go round and round trying to chase your symptoms. And my response a lot of the time is, are you showering in tap water, and what water are you drinking? If you just start there, that's really, really important. And you'll notice a huge systemic benefit to not only your physical health, but your mental and emotional health, because even hard minerals, inorganic minerals in solution, do cause calcification. When you get calcification in your brain, you have neurotransmitter imbalance because these go in the glands in your brain and your brain can't function properly. And then you add endotoxin to the mix and all of these things, and it just becomes wild. And I think that's why we have the world that we do. So you can check them out on justthrivehealth.com. My discount code's Blackburn for 15% off any of their products. Definitely recommend their spore-based probiotics and their IgG supplement. Those are great to start with, and you'll notice a huge difference. And you can find all of my other products on matt-blackburn.com. I just discounted my PUFA Protect to $30. And if you use the discount code first time, you save 15% on top of that. I'm reformulating it, so it's an exciting time, and I'm just clearing out old stock. It works great. I still take it, and it's a non-GMO sunflower-derived vitamin E. And you really have to ask, where are you getting vitamin E in your diet? And you're really not. And you really have to ask even deeper, how much polyunsaturated fatty acids did I consume my entire life until I even learned what a PUFA was? And then you might have a light bulb go off and say, hey, maybe the antidote vitamin E is necessary to supplement for a time, maybe not the rest of your life, but especially if you go out to a restaurant and they're cooking your steak or your burger or your fries in canola oil, because that could ruin your night. That could have an effect on maybe a interview, a date, whatever you're doing. It could really affect your ability to articulate and just function overall. PUFAs are really the root cause of a lot of issues in the world today. And so, yeah, I have the Pristine Hydro Travel water filter on there. It's $800. That's the best $800 you'll ever spend. Only have to replace the filters once. That is my go-to water filtration device. I travel with it, everything. And yeah, just a lot of cool stuff on the website. If you're not ready to eat beef liver yet, you can do the desiccated capsules. I've been on a beef liver kick, eating it a lot, like pretty much daily. Grass-fed, actually bison liver. And that's made a huge difference in my overall health. It's kind of profound. My body just responds so well to raw liver. And I just cut it up and just swallow them whole and then freeze the rest in cubes in the freezer. And all of my Mitolife products you can find at mitolife.co. And I'm coming out with 2 or 3 products in the next week. Really excited about that. And they're going to be pretty innovative. And as always, if you like the show, it really means a lot if you can just share it with your friends. Just send them a link to an episode that you think they could benefit from. A lot of what I share is really deep, and just a little tweet, short, paragraph doesn't really do it. It doesn't really get to people. So the cool thing about a podcast is it can provide the context to get you to an understanding and that you couldn't get to just reading a blog post or something like that. And I love asking people questions, so that's why I started Mitolife Radio. But yeah, it really means a lot if you can share the show, because I think that I'm sharing some awesome information on here that isn't often talked about. Not a lot of people talking about acid rain and NPK fertilizer and the effect on human health. Today's quote is by Justus von Liebig. The person who observes a clock sees in it not only the pendulum swinging to and fro, and the dial plate, and the hands moving, for a child can see all this, but he sees also the parts of the clock, and in what connection the suspended weight stands to the wheelwork, and the pendulum to the moving hands.